That Sunday morning started like any other. Church bells rang, kids rode bikes, and families set out lawn chairs for backyard barbecues. But by 10 a.m., police had set up crime scene tape along the banks of Forked Creek, for miles from the Fox family home. Fishermen had discovered something floating in the water, something small, something unthinkable. It was the body of 3-year-old Riley Fox. She had vanished from her home sometime during the night. Her father, Kevin Fox, said he'd last seen her asleep on the couch after she'd crawled out of bed. He and his 2 children had fallen asleep watching a movie together, a Saturday night tradition. At some point, Kevin woke up and went to bed, assuming his daughter would follow. She never did. When he woke up the next morning, Riley was gone. The search began immediately. Volunteers, police officers, K-9 units. Everyone knew Riley, her big brown eyes, her love of butterflies, her way of charming every adult she met. Wilmington wasn't used to Amber Alerts, and certainly not for a toddler taken from her own home while her father and brother slept upstairs. The news hit like a tidal wave. By mid-morning, her photo was plastered across local stations. Missing 3-year-old banners ran under anchors' voices. But just as quickly as hope had spread, it was replaced by horror. Riley wasn't lost. She hadn't wandered off. She'd been taken, bound, assaulted, and drowned. I remember when the first national story dropped. I was in a newsroom in Dallas back then, reading the wires over coffee. The headline stopped me cold. Illinois toddler abducted and murdered, father questioned. I remember the photo of Kevin Fox, standing behind police tape, his face frozen somewhere between disbelief and guilt. Something felt off. Something in the timeline. Something in the way the police rushed to announce they were closing in on a suspect. It didn't take long. Within days, Kevin Fox, the grieving father, became the #1 suspect. I wasn't there yet, but I would be, because as I would later learn, the real story wasn't just about a murdered child. It was about a justice system that accused the wrong man and nearly let a predator walk free. And it all began in a town where people never locked their doors. When I first drove into Wilmington to begin my own investigation, one of the locals, a retired firefighter, told me something that stuck with me. They didn't want the truth, he said. They wanted closure. And that's exactly what this part of the story is about. From the moment Riley's body was discovered, pressure on local authorities skyrocketed. A brutal murder of a child in a small, peaceful town? The mayor, the sheriff, the state attorney, everyone needed answers, and fast. Within 72 hours, they had a suspect. Kevin Fox. To the public, it almost made sense. He was the last person to see her alive. He had a scratch on his arm, and there was something about his demeanor that some people called off. But if you looked closer, if you looked like an investigator instead of a manhunt leader, the case didn't hold up. Let's start with the so-called confession. After nearly 14 hours in an interrogation room, with no lawyer present, Kevin Fox said words that detectives claimed amounted to a confession. What they didn't say was that he had asked for an attorney and had been denied. They didn't mention the psychological tactics used against him: isolation, intimidation, threats that he'd never see his son again. It was classic coercion, and any experienced journalist or prosecutor should have seen it. And the evidence? Practically non-existent. There was no sign of forced entry, but the back door's lock was broken, something Kevin had reported weeks earlier. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing to place him at the scene where Riley's body was found. But none of that mattered once he was in custody. The authorities had their story, and they stuck to it. According to their version, Kevin got angry. Maybe over money, maybe over stress. He snapped, killed Riley, and dumped her body in Forked Creek before pretending she was missing. They offered no clear motive, no timeline that made sense. But the media didn't question it, not yet. What followed was 8 months of hell. Kevin was held in Will County Jail, charged with the first-degree murder of his own daughter. His wife, Melissa, stood by him, but their world had collapsed. Their surviving son, Tyler, was traumatized. The community was divided. Neighbors whispered. Reporters repeated every line the sheriff's department fed them. But outside the spotlight, something else was brewing. Kevin's family refused to give up. They hired private attorneys. One of them, Kathleen Zellner, was known for cracking wrongful convictions wide open. She started digging into the interrogation, the forensic reports, the sloppy assumptions. And then she found it. There had been DNA collected from Riley's body, male DNA, and it didn't match Kevin. The sample had been sitting in an evidence locker for months. Unprocessed. Ignored. Authorities had never even bothered to test it. They didn't want anything that might derail their version of the truth. That choice, the decision to pursue a narrative over facts, nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. And it let a child predator walk free for 6 more years. By the time I sat down with Kevin Fox years later, his voice still trembled when he talked about the jail cell. Not the bars, not the stink, not the guards. What haunted him most was the silence. The nights he sat awake, knowing the man who killed his daughter was still out there, and no one was looking for him. Justice in America is supposed to be blind, but sometimes it just turns its head. By late 2004, Kevin Fox had spent months in jail, and the public had largely accepted the idea that he was a killer. But behind the scenes, something critical was happening, something the authorities weren't talking about. DNA. During Riley's autopsy, swabs were taken from her body. The tests revealed the presence of male DNA, not from Kevin, and not from anyone in the Fox family. This wasn't contamination. It was evidence. A silent witness. But for months, no one tested it. Why? Because the state's case didn't need it. They had a coerced confession and a grieving public that needed a villain. A confession, even one produced after hours of pressure, is hard to undo in the court of public opinion. DNA? That only complicates things. It was Kathleen Zellner, the Fox family's new attorney, who finally pushed for the truth. She demanded the evidence be tested. And when it was, the results came back crystal clear. Kevin Fox was not the source of the DNA found on Riley. With that, the case collapsed. The charges against Kevin were dropped. The public apology from prosecutors? It never really came. What they offered instead was silence and spin. They claimed the investigation had taken a new direction, but they never admitted they'd made a mistake. Kevin was released after 8 months in jail, but the damage was permanent. His reputation, his job, his marriage, all cracked under the pressure. Even after being exonerated, he was still the man whose daughter had died on his watch. And the killer? Still unknown. The Fox family filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Will County, arguing that the sheriff's department had fabricated evidence, ignored crucial facts, and violated Kevin's constitutional rights. The trial pulled back the curtain on just how broken the investigation had been. I sat in on several days of that trial. I watched jurors flinch as they heard audio from the interrogation room. I read transcripts where officers admitted they had no physical evidence, just a gut feeling. The jury awarded the Fox family $15. $5 million. The judge later reduced it to $8 million. It was one of the largest civil rights payouts in Illinois history. But no one in law enforcement lost their badge. No one apologized. No one said Riley deserved better. And still, no suspect. For the Fox family, the lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about making sure no other family had to suffer what they did. But behind that fight was a deeper, darker truth. The man who killed Riley Fox had never stopped being free. And if he could slip through the cracks once, who's to say he hadn't done it before, or wouldn't do it again? I remember walking out of that courtroom, looking back at Kevin. He didn't look like a man celebrating. He looked like someone still carrying the weight of a little girl's last moments. That's when I knew this story wasn't over. Not even close. By 2010, 6 years had passed since Riley Fox was buried in a tiny white casket. Kevin had been cleared. The lawsuit had ended. The headlines were gone. But justice? Still missing. That's when I got the first call. A contact of mine from the Illinois State Police, someone who'd tipped me before on corruption cases, reached out. They had reopened the Riley Fox case quietly, with a new team, and something had come back from the National DNA Database. A hit. A real one this time. The name was Scott Eby. I didn't recognize it. He wasn't from Wilmington. He had no connection to the Fox family. But a closer look painted a terrifying picture, one that left me chilled long before I ever saw his face. Eby had been living just a few blocks from the Fox home in 2004, crashing at his mother's house after a recent stint in prison. He had a long criminal history, including burglary and a prior conviction for sexual assault. At the time of Riley's murder, he was on parole. He had no job, no structure, no supervision. He wandered the town at night, looking for opportunities. According to newly uncovered evidence, Eby had been breaking into homes in Wilmington in the weeks leading up to the murder. Quiet, low-level thefts, Cash, electronics, nothing flashy. Police hadn't connected the dots then. They hadn't even noticed the pattern. But it was all in the details. In the weeks after the murder, a pair of muddy sneakers had been found in Forked Creek, the same place where Riley's body was discovered. No one had made anything of it at the time. But when detectives finally revisited the evidence, they noticed something strange. Inside one of the shoes, barely legible, was the name Scott Eby. It had been there the whole time. Investigators tracked him down at a correctional facility in Pontiac, Illinois, where he was serving time for another crime. He didn't resist. In fact, he confessed almost immediately. But the most horrifying part wasn't that he admitted guilt, it was how casually he described it. He said he'd been walking around Wilmington that night, drunk, looking for a house to rob. He noticed the back door of the Fox home had a broken lock. He went in. There was nothing worth stealing. But then he saw Riley, asleep on the couch. From that moment on, the crime became something else entirely. Eby carried her out of the house, walked with her through the quiet streets, and drove to a nearby wooded park. He said he didn't know why he chose that bathroom. He just did. He raped her there. Then, when the bandana covering his face slipped down, he panicked. He drove to Forked Creek, carried her into the water, and held her under. He left her body and the shoes behind. It was evil in its purest form, opportunistic, remorseless, and invisible for years. When I first read the full confession, I had to stop halfway through. As a reporter, you train yourself to keep emotional distance. But this was different. This was a story where justice had been delayed not because the truth was hidden, but because no one had bothered to look for it. Had the DNA been tested immediately, Eby would have been caught within days. Riley might have been spared the headlines. Kevin might have been spared the cell. The town might have been spared the shame. But that didn't happen. Because systems fail. People fail. And when they do, children die. When Scott Eby finally sat down with detectives, he didn't cry. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even ask for a lawyer. He just talked, like it was a bad memory he'd been carrying too long and wanted to get rid of. I've read a lot of confessions. Some are filled with denial. Others are soaked in self-pity. But Eby stood out for one reason: how ordinary he made it sound. How mundane. That night, he said he got drunk. Again, it wasn't unusual. He was a repeat offender, used to slipping in and out of homes for easy grabs. When he walked through Wilmington, he didn't even think twice about entering the Fox house. The back door was broken. He called it an invitation. He expected to find cash. A laptop maybe. But instead, he found Riley, a sleeping 3-year-old in pink pajamas, curled up on the couch. He said she looked like she didn't belong there, like she'd fallen asleep watching a movie. He stood over her for a minute, then another, and then he picked her up. Eby carried her outside, put her in the back of his car, and drove 5 minutes to Forsyth Woods Park. The park was deserted at that hour. He took her to the public restroom, a cold, tiled space with flickering fluorescent lights. It was there that he assaulted her. He claimed she cried, that he told her everything would be okay, that he didn't want to hurt her. Then the bandana he was wearing, to cover his face, slipped. Riley saw him. She looked him in the eyes. That was the moment everything changed. He told police he panicked, that he couldn't risk being identified, that he didn't know what else to do. So he drove to Forked Creek, the same place he'd been before, the same place locals fished and teenagers snuck off to drink beer on Friday nights. He walked into the water with Riley in his arms, and he held her under. It's hard to write those words, harder still to say them out loud. But I do it because this isn't just a story about a child's murder. It's a story about how evil hides in plain sight, and how it flourishes when no one bothers to look beneath the surface. After killing Riley, Eby tossed the bandana and shoes into the creek. He went home, drank more, slept. He wasn't caught because he was smart. He was caught because years later, a group of people finally decided to follow the evidence. Not a hunch, not a narrative, but the facts. It took 6 years. 6 years of silence. 6 years in which he could have hurt someone else. I spoke to Riley's mother, Melissa, not long after the confession became public. She told me she felt two things: horror and vindication. Horror at what Riley endured, and vindication that her husband, and their truth, had finally been believed. When I asked Kevin what justice looked like now, he didn't talk about prison or death. He just said this: I want people to remember Riley for how she lived, not how she died. It was one of the hardest interviews I've ever done. but also one of the most necessary. Because sometimes, to stop the next monster, you have to face the one who already struck. In June 2025, word came down from the Illinois Department of Corrections. Scott Eby was dead. He died inside Menard Correctional Center, a high-security prison on the banks of the Mississippi River. Officially, the cause was listed as natural. Those sources later told me it was liver failure, the result of decades of drinking, neglect, and decay. He was 52. There was no funeral, no public obituary. No one claimed the body. The prison shipped his remains to a crematorium, and that was the end of Scott Eby. A quiet death for a man who had stolen a life in the loudest, cruelest way imaginable. But for the Fox family, it wasn't really an ending. I returned to Wilmington that summer. The town had changed. More security systems. More streetlights. People locked their doors now. Riley's memory lived on in murals, playgrounds, and butterfly stickers on windshields. Her mother still lived nearby. Her father had remarried and moved away, trying to build something resembling peace. I sat down with their family attorney, Kathleen Zellner, the same woman who had helped clear Kevin's name 20 years earlier. When I asked her if Eby's death brought justice, she paused before answering. No, she said. Justice would have been Riley growing up. Riley graduating high school. Riley holding her father's hand when he was old. She was right. Justice delayed is justice denied. But some wounds never close at all. Still, something had shifted. Eby was gone. No more appeals. No more press. No more nightmare. And the people who failed Riley, the detectives who pushed a false confession, the prosecutors who looked away from evidence, would forever carry that stain. In many ways, this story isn't just about what happened in 2004. It's about what happens when truth is inconvenient. When systems cut corners. When law enforcement seeks closure more than accountability. Because make no mistake, Riley Fox didn't have to die. Her killer could have been stopped years earlier. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a genius. He was a repeat offender hiding in plain sight, waiting for an opportunity. And the system gave him one. As I stood at Forked Creek one last time, the water moved slowly under a cloudy sky. Somewhere beneath that surface, the shoes had once drifted. The bandana. The body of a child who trusted the world around her. Now, nothing remained. Only the silence. And a promise to never look away again.